emotions become holy. On your heart, so your heart becomes holy. What's in the law is going to tell us what's in the Spirit, what the Spirit does, and the power you have if you live it. The law is filled with thou shalt nots. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not covet. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not. A lot of knots, and we don't usually like knots. You get all knotted up when you concentrate on knots. There's a lot of knots in the law. But it's all right. You can't argue with it. Thou shalt not lie. Thou shalt not covet, of course. In the new covenant, there are also a lot of knots. It's not just say we do whatever we like. There's a lot of knots. In fact, in some ways, you could say it's even more. In the law, it says don't murder. In the new covenant, it says don't even think that hatred. In the law, it says don't commit adultery. In the new covenant, it says you even look at a woman like that. So there's knots, and you know them because you're probably conscious of them every day. If you love the Lord, you're probably conscious of them every day. Probably, Lord, I don't want to do it. Help me not to do it. Because you struggle with them. Thou shalt not gossip. Thou shalt not lust. Thou shalt not look at that on the internet. Thou shalt not become bitter. Thou shalt not be dishonest or fudge that thing. Thou shalt not even look at that thing. Thou shalt not waste your hours in watching something that's going to do nothing for you and God. And you struggle with it. Because it's hard to not do it. Not doing something is hard. When you try not to think about something, it's hard. If I say right now, nobody think about a pink elephant. What are you doing? You're thinking about pink elephants. And I just said, don't do it. It's hard to not think. Nature abhors a vacuum. It's hard to empty yourself. In fact, it's impossible for you to do it. Trying not to sin is trying not to be fleshly is hard. It's like it's like having a dog on a leash. You used to have a dog, and if the dog would see a rabbit, it would just, no matter what, run, and you're just trying to pull it back. Well, the flesh is the flesh. The flesh is never going to improve. The flesh is not there to be improved. The flesh is there to be put to death. It's hard not to sin, but the law was fulfilled, that was filled with thou shalt not, was fulfilled on the day that the Spirit came, which on the commemorating the law, the Spirit came. So the Spirit gives us the power of thou shalt not. You understand? The Spirit is the power of thou shalt not. The Spirit gives you the power. We don't normally think of the Spirit that way. We think more in terms of the Spirit does, or than rather what it doesn't do. But the power of thou shalt not is part of the moving of the Spirit. You read of the fruits of the Spirit. Love, you like that. Joy, great. Goodness, great. Gentleness, great. Self-control doesn't seem to fit in because the rest is just kind of flowing. But self-control, that doesn't seem like flowing. That seems hard. And you look at some people who claim to be in the Spirit, and the first thing you think about is not self-control. You think of it's the fruit of out of control more than the fruit of self-control. But self-control is also a fruit of the Spirit. It's the power of thou shalt not. It says that if you walk by the Spirit, you will not fulfill the desires of the flesh. You won't. Self-control. It says by the Spirit we can put to death the deeds of the flesh. You can do it. It says by the Spirit, that means you can stop lusting. You can not covet. You can stop these things. It seems like a negative thing. No, thou shalt not, but it's really a positive thing. It's the presence of God drives out that stuff. You can't stop doing one thing if you don't have another thing that you're doing to replace it. You can't die to the old if you don't have a new to live to. You can't die. How can you die to the flesh without the Spirit? If all you have is flesh, what can you do? So it says, don't be drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit. In other words, it goes together. Don't be drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit. If you are filled with the Spirit, you're not going to be drunk with wine or drunk with pornography or drunk with the other things. Because if a cup is filled up, you cannot put anything else in there. If it's overflowing, you can't do a thing about it. So the greatest spiritual defense is to have a great spiritual offense. The more you live by the Spirit, the more you'll have the power of thou shalt not. Just as when you walk through a supermarket on an empty stomach,